tired of the theological reflection section in 2 Corinthians. Too bad. We've been on 2 Corinthians 2:14 following for some time now, and if you couldn't tell, I find this utterly fascinating, amazing, and I think important for us passage of Scripture. One of the things I thought about as I was preparing this last night, as we move into that digression, fairly quickly we come to his statement that God has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant. And it actually starts to sound like a pretty good deal. God has made us adequate to be ministers of a new covenant. A covenant of the Holy Spirit, not a covenant of the letter of the law. It comes with glory, so much glory that it surpasses the glory of Mount Sinai. It means that our faces can be unveiled, that the things that keep us from seeing God and God in the Old Covenant can be taken away when we turn to the Lord. With unveiled faces, we can actually contemplate and maybe even reflect the glory of the Lord. We're being transformed from glory to glory. We've abandoned the hidden things of shame or shameful hidden things. And we discover the light of the knowledge of the glory of God on the face of Jesus Christ from the very God who created light that shined into our hearts in this way. All of which is glorious and wonderful stuff. It just sounds a bit different than the first part of this book, where he was despairing even of life itself in chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. And then this ongoing sort of description of the problems between himself and the Corinthians, between the Corinthians and other Corinthians, people who had done pretty nasty things to each other. And you kind of wonder at the distance between this glorious ministry picture he paints in, maybe you don't wonder. I wonder about this marvelous picture of the ministry that he paints, of the gospel that he paints in this theological digression, and how it connects to what had been going on in his life, nitty-gritty sort of stuff. And he actually starts to address that connection in verse 7 of chapter 4, and we started that and talked to a few things about that section, but that's where we want to pick up today. So would someone read verses 7 through 12 of 2 Corinthians chapter 4 out loud for us?
We have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you.
Okay, thank you. We talked a little bit about the treasure last week, kind of as the period was coming to an end. Maybe it's the ministry that we've been talking about. Maybe it's the glory. Maybe it's all this good stuff we've just sort of summarized in introduction here. And we talked about having it in clay jars. And not all of you wanted to catch the point because you knew something about nice clay jars somewhere. But the point here is the clay jars are fragile. They break. They don't last. They're weak. They're susceptible, we would say, to failure. And those of you that, those of you that do a lot of things, entertain, put on public demonstration, you know that things that are susceptible to failure will fail at the most unopportune times. Just the last minute or right when there's people coming or something of that nature. You could imagine that's when clay pots broke cooking, was when company was coming in the ancient world too. And so the point is this marvelous treasure and then the earthen vessel clay pot. I think I resisted last week, but I can't this week. Cracked pots for us to describe our nature, our own susceptibility to failure, and in essence the cracked pot is Paul and the Corinthian church's relationship. There's a place where what is the treasure of this glorious ministry was being held in some cracked pots named Corinthians and named Paul and Timothy. And for all the glory which is still true, it's also true that there was brokenness, failure in communication, inopportune kinds of things. Now, verse 7 also says that God has a purpose in that structure. And what's that purpose?
His power will be shown strong.
And furthermore, what will be shown about our power?
We ain't got it.
Not so much when it comes to strong. The Greek is a fun word. Our word hyperbole comes from this. In order that the hyperbole of the power, the thrown beyond, the beyond a measure, beyond imagination of the power, might be of God. Might be recognized to be of God and not of ourselves. The greatness of the power is the treasure. The ourselves is the cracked pots. This is an important verse for us. Are we ever tempted to think that it depends on us? Only when we're awake and asleep. And one of the hardest lessons to learn and to be relearned and relearned and relearned is that the greatness of the power comes from God and not ourselves. That's true in professional ministry, if I can say that for a moment. You work really, really hard to prepare a worship service, and you think you got a marvelous kind of thing all organized, and it falls flat. And you are caught on some kind of unavoidable sorts of things and don't get all the prep in you'd hoped, and somehow God speaks to people through the idiotic things you say stumbling along, and you want to say, this is not fair, God. I should be blessed when I've prepared well, and this shouldn't happen, that you're present and powerful when I'm messing up. And God just sort of says, you don't understand what this is all about, do you? It happens in our daily lives anyway, that when we think we've got it most together, it's like water running through our fingers. And when we're sort of frantic because we can't keep it together, we discover the grace of God being sufficient. The greatness of power might be of God and not of ourselves. I've said it 6 times. I'd like to say it 6 more times, just so you'd be so mad at me you'd remember that kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is, remembering it in our heads isn't what it's about. It's managing to sort of orient our lives to this truth again in the midst of those circumstances as they come and go. Well, where he goes then, starting in verses 8 through 12, it is a sets of sort of contrasting statements, which I think relate in one way or another to the treasure, or the cracked pot, or the greatness of the power of God, or the lack of greatness of our power. So, in verse 8 and in verse 9, there are 2 pairs in each verse. The first pair in verse 8. This translation has, we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Now, we've seen this word afflicted before, if you remember it. And one of my favorite ways to translate it is pressured. We are pressured in every way, but not crushed. So the picture is of something doing this to us, pressing against us. But what's the outcome? It doesn't crush us. Now, does that mean there's no real pressure? No, the pressure is very real and very great, but it is not terminal pressure. It's not crushing pressure. It's not the end of life pressure. It's not the end of functioning pressure. Now, we sometimes feel like it is. And sometimes we would we would tell others and tell God it is. There is a verse in 1 Corinthians 10:13. You know that one? God will not test us beyond what we're able to bear, but will with the temptation provide a exbossus, an exit, a way out, an exit ramp somewhere. And I think that's connected to this verse. Pressured, but not crushed. Now,
Roger,
yeah,
this whole thing, this paragraph seems, I don't know what the right words are, paradoxical, frustrating. We get to the point where, okay, I see it, God is all sufficient, nothing's gonna bother me, and boom, the hammer comes down, and, I'm pressured. At the same time, knowing, that's where the paradox or the frustration comes in, that this shouldn't bother me, because I know God is sufficient, but it really bothers me, And I find it in all, I won't say passage after passage, but it's that struggle to live above, that struggle to trust and always be victorious. But yet, I guess his hammer is bigger than my anvil, and it just is paradoxical and frustrating.
Yeah.
Amen.
Well, and shouldn't we be upset when bad things happen? I mean, bad things happen to really good people.
Yeah, but theoretically,
But
I've risen above. I'm God's
but it doesn't
child.
change a reaction to something bad.
I think you said, at least in my mind, one of the key words, to reduce this down to a simple formula is silly. But you used the word trust in the midst of your comments. And then you went, and be triumphant or victorious. I don't know that we always need to be victorious, but the call is always to trust. Because bad things happen. And a part of the challenge that I think Paul is giving to us is, can we, yes we can, will we trust God to find a way through those bad things? Now, yeah, there's tension here because we can't seem to get it down, which I think he understands. How many times does he say this in these verses? Like 7 or 8 times this basic concept is addressed, which speaks of a preacher who is desperately trying to get something across and coming at it from different angles, hoping one of those will be the hook that finally catches, and we, quote, get it. I also am of the opinion, and to use a phrase from 1 Corinthians, I say this, not the Lord, that we may never get to, some personalities among us may never get to the point that we don't find this sort of struggle. My opinion is that those of us who never get there should find our response time to figure out what's happening less. You understand what I mean? The first few times in our lives that we go through this sort of cycle, we really struggle to figure out what's going on and what we should have done and what we should respond. Some of us have been through it enough times. We're part way in the cycle when we suddenly realize, oh, I've blown it again. I'm trusting God. This is an issue. And we'll usually spend a few more moments or hours or days or weeks or some cases months grinding our teeth and being mad, partly at ourselves as well as at the circumstances and at God. But we've figured out what we're supposed to be doing again is trusting Him. And so our struggle is moved from pure anger into how can I actually let go of the greatness of my power and put it in the greatness of God's power, to trust Him. Yeah, it's a paradox. There's all kinds of contradictory tension. It's full of tension, almost but not quite.
I'm pessimistic. This is a maturing, refining process, and every time I reach a plateau, something bigger comes. You know?
Yeah,
It'll never end.
yeah. Well, that's a good thing. Because what's the final goal that God has for us?
So we all come to the full.
Yeah,
full
fullness of the
stature.
stature of the measure of Christ. You take Ephesians 4, about 14 or 13, yeah. To become imitators of Christ, become imitators of God, become like Christ, become like God. And wherever we are in that maturing process, we aren't there yet. And so in a certain sense, it's a compliment that God plateaus us and then says, okay, you've achieved this much. Time to step up and become more Christ-like, more godly. And it's a struggle and it's hard. And for most of us, it'll be 2 steps forward, 1 back, 3 steps forward, 2 back, 3 forward, 3 back. I mean, it's a back and forth kind of thing before the victories, if you want to call them that, are when you achieve plateaus. And there's a passage in Galatians. Galatians 5:26, I think. Only stay in step with the Spirit. This is the one that paraphrases it. Stay in step with the Spirit. And up to what you've achieved, stay there, maintain. In other words, as the Spirit leads you to a plateau, you got to sort of dig in and stay at that level. Because God has the next growing process to be based on that plateau. And a part of, I don't know if God ever gets frustrated. I can't imagine He wouldn't with me. A part of what would frustrate God, I would think, would be when He's got me to a plateau and I'm supposed to be dug in and staying there because we're getting ready to prepare for the next growth. I start letting that plateau drizzle away, be washed out by the floods came up, the rains came down, and all of a sudden I'm back at some other level than where I had been. I think this is one of the places where being a Wesleyan was really helpful to me. And the Wesleyan phrase, the optimism of grace. Yeah. That God keeps thinking, we can do this. You can do this. I can do this. That's God's opinion. I'm convinced I can't do this. And God says, sure you can. And this is how I'm going to go after getting you there this time. And maybe it's immense pain, maybe it's blessing, who knows what it might be. But yeah, there's a lot of tension in this text. David?
Just the passage, Galatians, I think is the one you're referencing.
Yeah.
Since we live by the Spirit, let us
Stay.
step with the Spirit.
Yeah. I may be digging a little bit of Philippians 3:15 into it too.
What was the verse, the chapter and verse?
5:26. Galatians 5:26.
26, okay, thank you.
Or 25. 25, yeah.
Is that verse after the talking about the fruit of the
Yep.
Spirit, love, joy,
Yep.
peace, patience?
Follows right on that
So
tail.
we're staying in the fruit of the Spirit, or letting this fruit of the Spirit flow through us.
Mhm.
We're staying in step with that.
Yep. Yep. The Greek is kind of tough, and so stay in step is one way of saying don't lose. In one of the sermons I've done on this 1,000 years ago, drive a stake down there and hold your ground, because there's further growth to come, testing and challenge. Okay.
What do you think the term Christ-like really means?
Whoa.
I don't think that we can come to that in Christ.
Well, yeah, there's books on it, and they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
That's all well and good, but anybody who's got to be full of themselves to think they can be like Christ.
Why you need
Something
somebody
to
to
aim
Christ
for,
instead of yourself?
Nobody
Aim
can
for
be
it.
as perfect as Christ
Well,
was.
no.
No,
Like something.
I think that misinterprets the word like, overinterprets it, maybe not mis.
Well, that's what
When
I'm
we
saying.
talk about our kids, when they were little, people would say, "Oh, Timothy sure is like his dad." Well, he wasn't the same as.
Right.
He was a much. Now, Tuesday at district credentials interviews, the first lady that walked in, we introduced ourselves, and I introduced myself, Rod Johnson. She says, "Oh, are you Tim's dad?" Yeah, she says, "He's a good person. I hope you're okay." That sense, no, we'll never be equal to Christ. And that's why, but that's the goal. And so the, if you want to call it the calculus of ever getting closer and closer, but never quite getting there. Another description of it is the fruit of the Spirit. If you look at the fruit of the Spirit, those characteristics, love, joy, peace, patience, meekness, greatness of suffering, all of those are characteristics that describe what you find in the Gospels. Yeah.
This whole concept of this, of the Galatians passage though, is that the Spirit is always moving forward.
Yeah.
And we need to keep moving forward.
Yeah. Now, sometimes I think we could read that as if the Spirit was just mechanically, he's going 59 miles an hour and we got to keep up with him. Always moving forward, but I think he adjusts his pace when we stumble. He slows down when we slow down. He speeds up when we're ready to go. And the point of that, and that translates, stay in step with him. Because he is also staying in step with us. Chip and then Renee.
I was, is this kind of our denominational position, or is this?
What? What I just said?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
Yes.
I was building a home for a lady, and her husband, she was executive, and they're good Catholic folks.
Yeah.
And it was Holy Week. So she was driving along in her car, talking to me on the phone, and very colorful language, so to speak. I want this done, certain phrases. But Holy Week's coming up, so I gotta get this done, because we got family coming over. And then I think her dish, some sort of casserole was on the seat, it slid off, so I heard a few other phrases. And I'm wondering about the Catholics, brothers, you know, they sort of, I don't know if they're going after this as much as we are. Is this something that we look at ourselves, we have to attain, as Carol was referencing, do we have to go out after the calculus in terms of the highest degree? Or, you know, is our Catholic brothers, are they saying, well, the priesthood can do this, but we don't have to? How does that work? In 2 minutes or less.
2 minutes or less. Yeah. Not wanting to cast any aspersions on folks of other denominations.
No.
You mentioned the priest versus the lay distinction. The church struggling with this very issue, I think, in about the 3rd and 4th centuries, sort of created levels of holiness, and one was to be clergy and one was to be lay. I think the Protestant Reformation, without intending to or explicitly saying so, rejected that and say, you know, God is calling all of us to a level of commitment and obedience. And that certainly is, lots of folks understand that. But it's been a part of our, you know, call it our denominational DNA, that we are called to give our utmost for his highest, to use the phrase of Oswald Chambers' book. And that out of the Wesleyan heritage of the optimism of grace is that we believe God actually enables us to make far more progress toward this than we ever could simply by human effort. And so It's like there's always this invitation from God for more. Jess Middendorf used a word back when Word and Table was going on, and he and I would robe up together in the back room and make comments about the sermon I would preach, the sermon he would preach, and all that. There was one on holiness. He said, we have been too concerned about possessing it and not enough about aspiring to it. That it's the aspiration for holiness, not the possession of it, that ought to characterize us. We want this. We yearn for this. I'm sorry for all the rest of you that want to be on the conversation. I'm supposed to dismiss at this point. We yearn for this. We aspire to this. God calls us to this. And so it's good news for us that the greatness of the powers of God and not of ourselves. And that when we feel pressured, we're not ultimately crushed. And I guess we will, we've covered half a verse maybe today. We'll see what happens next week. Dorothy will tell me I should be happy. I don't have to print a bunch of stuff. I'm headed to Oklahoma City this afternoon to teach an intensive class at Bethany. So 8 hours a day for 5 days is nice stuff for young people. And for us old folks, I'm looking forward to Friday getting home. Father, we are grateful that you invite us toward the purposes and the life for which you originally created us before we fell into rebellion and seeking to rely on our own power. And I pray that for those amongst us overwhelmed by our failure to achieve as much